If the workers' opposition was a group of pro-union proletarians with one very notable aristocrat, then the Democratic Centralists were the opposite. They are a collective of pro-Soviet intellectuals with one very notable proletarian. Michel Olivier wrote that there is an obvious and direct connection between the Democratic Centralists and the Brest opposition, and he is entirely correct. The same is true of Myasnikov's workers' group. Both the Democratic Centralists, two of the Brest opposition's major figures, Smirnov and Obolinski that is, became its leaders along with Timofey Sapronov. According to Edouard Dunne, Gavril Myasnikov, and Ian Hebbs, there are two Democratic Centralism groups, those being the 1919 to 1923 group and the 1926 group, which was a left-wing splinter that simply became the Group of 15 around Sapronov. The 15 in question were N. Zavaryan, B. Yemelyanov, Timofey Sapronov, M. N. Mino, M. I. Menkov, Vladimir Smirnov, T. Korechko, V. P. Oberin, Isaac Dashkovsky, S. Schreiber, M. Smirnov, F. I. Pilipenko, Edouard Dunne, A. L. Slidovker, and L. Tikhonov. Out of those 15, only one person survived while staying in Russia, and that was Isaac Dashkovsky, who spent 30 years of his life in prison. When he was released in 1956, he was 65 years old. From there, he lived on as a pensioner and professor until 1972. The only other survivor was Edouard Dunne, who somehow managed to escape abroad and died in 1953. Those two represented the last of a generation in Russian revolutionary society, men from a bygone era. They were jettisoned from the state they helped to build due to their opposition to the direction which his leadership was taking it. But before all that occurs, the Democratic Centralists, like the workers' opposition, would find their origin at the March 1919 Party Congress. They arose in reaction to shifts in the party's internal workings and economic policies. Their primary goal was related to the name which they chose for themselves, that is, the restoration of democratic centralism in the party. The group had come to feel that during the course of the war, that the party was violating the principles of democratic centralism. The group then wished to steer the party back onto a proper path, one that allowed for increased local initiative, inter-party democracy, and open discussion in all levels of the party. Despite their name, centralist, much of what the group advocated would have involved decentralization, and thus the party leadership charged them with being excessively decentralist. Again, just like the workers' opposition, the Democratic Centralists were opposed to the perceived bureaucratic degeneration of the party. All decision-making had become centralized in the hands of the small Central Committee and the even smaller Politburo. This sort of centralism they denounced as bureaucratic centralism, opposed to a genuinely democratic centralism, which they believed meant greater local initiative and participation from the party rank and file. The Democratic Centralists, during its 1919 to 1921 phase, although dubbed an opposition, sought to fight internally for a democratic reform of the party so that it could be more inclusive for all party members. On their views, Schapiro writes, the Democratic Centralists, in the course of 1919 and 1920, urged the need for greater freedom within the party. They demanded that the Central Committee should not manage the party, but guide it, giving it a general direction but not interfering in details. They insisted that every important question should be widely discussed among the party rank and file before a decision was taken on it. Central Committee meetings, other than secret meetings, should be open to all party members. In party elections, representation of minority views should be assured, and such minorities should be given facilities for publishing their views. Comrade Lenin says, Obolinski said at the Ninth Party Congress in March 1920, that the essence of democratic centralism is contained in the fact that the Party Congress elects the Central Committee, while the Central Committee manages the party. We cannot agree with this somewhat fanciful view. We believe that democratic centralism consists in the putting into effect of the directives of the Central Committee by the local organizations, in the responsible autonomy of the latter, and in the responsibility for their spheres of work. But this right here is where the similarities between the Democratic Centralists and the workers' opposition end. Unlike the workers' opposition, the Democratic Centralists made no fetish of trade unions and instead sought to reinvigorate the Soviets. These were the means for building the new society, not the unions. But, somewhat like the workers' opposition, or rather Shlapnikov, they felt that the party should lead the Soviets but not interfere in their activities, as to promote proletarian democracy and a culture of autonomy. Since the Democratic Centralists were essentially the last remnants of the 1918 opposition, they still held some of the views which they espoused prior, such as an opposition to technocratic methods of organization. They denounced the system of единонашали, one-man management, as reactionary, and they upheld workers' control instead. But Sapronov made it clear that his group understood the necessity of the bourgeois specialists. and were not dogmatically opposed to the uses of the specie, rather, they were opposed to how the party was presently using them. A curious matter which distinguished the Democratic Centralists from other elements of the Bolshevik left was their position on war communism. By 1919, the policy of war communism was in full swing, and while it was defended and accepted by most of the Bolshevik left, such as Bukharin, Krichman, and Preobrazhensky, the Democratic Centralists, as leftists, were unique in their opposition to its policy, and it preceded their future opposition to the police measures used to acquire grain from the countryside during the first 5-year plan in collectivization. At one point, left communism had swept all over Russia, but as quickly as it came, it died. Except for in a few holdouts, such as in the Urals and in the Ukraine, Ukraine had long been a hotbed of left communism, albeit in a different form from which existed in Moscow. Lefts like Pyatakov and Bubnov dominated party politics in the Ukraine during the early days of the revolution, and Pyatakov in particular quarreled with other party members in order to implement his anti-nationalist and left communist agenda. Eventually the left would lose ground in Ukraine, but by 1920, when lefts were falling out of favor with the party center, they would find themselves being transferred to Ukraine. Robert Daniels writes, "Despite Moscow's preferences, the Ukrainian left once again experienced a resurgence in 1920. A considerable number of new left-wing sympathizers appeared in the Ukraine for the first time, either because they were voluntarily attracted by the better opportunity to advance their cause there, or because Moscow was trying to get rid of them." Yakovlev complained, "The Ukraine is being transformed into a place of exile." Sapronov himself would be transferred to Kharkov, the second largest city in Ukraine, and which by 1920 was a right-wing stronghold. But, now based in Kharkov, Sapronov managed to capture the Ukrainian party organization for the left. Now in control, the Democratic Centralists packed the organization with new members, that is, with fellow Democratic Centralists and other sympathetic lefts who had been exiled or transferred to the Ukraine. With this new strength, the Democratic Centralists were allowed to elect 1/3 of the delegates to the Fourth Ukrainian Party Conference in March of 1920, and on this conference, Daniels writes, "This conference was a turbulent affair. Wave after wave of criticism was hurled at the Ukrainian rightists and at the Moscow party leadership. On economic policy, no less a figure than Stalin went down to defeat when he attempted to uphold Moscow, and Trotsky. On the militarization of critical sectors of the economy and on individual authority in industrial management. Particular rancor was expressed over Moscow's disbanding of the Ukrainian Central Committee during the Denikin offensive the previous fall. The general principle of subordination to Moscow was sharply attacked, although a majority of the conference remained sufficiently anti-nationalist to unseat one delegate on the ground of a federalist deviation. Ukrainian anti-centralism was carried by Bubnov to the form of the 9th Congress of the RCP. He declared before the assembled Russian leaders that the effect of Moscow's policy in the Ukraine had been to weaken the Soviet regime rather than to strengthen it. The best Ukrainian party workers, he charged, had been hounded or transferred because of their opposition to its views. Moscow interference, especially the dissolution of the Ukrainian Central Committee, had wrecked the Central Party organization in Ukraine, and the continuance of the rigorous anti-kulak policy caused the Ukrainian peasantry to become a dangerous base for anti-Soviet forces. The Russian party leadership showed little readiness to compromise with such sentiments. Rakovsky's defense at the Fourth Ukrainian Conference was to denounce the whole CPU as essentially degenerate. He charged that the organization, dominated, as it was, by oppositionist and separatist influence, was not really a party of the proletariat, but an intelligentsia bourgeois party, which is afraid of communist tasks. Such rebukes were ineffective, however. With the aid of Sapronov's Kharkov steamroller, the leftists won all important votes at the Congress, and once again elected a majority of the new Ukrainian Central Committee. Following this victory in the Ukraine, Sapronov, Osinsky, and Maximovsky would then draft a thesis on collegiate management, which appeared on March 23, 1920, before the 9th Party Congress. The thesis in its entirety is as follows. For proletarian power, neither collegiate nor individual leadership is the sole and unconditional principle of organizational construction. In different parts of the leadership, for different bodies and under different historical conditions, the meaning of one or the other principle can be different. Neither principle has absolute technical advantages. Individual management is generally not the simplest form of management, but collegiate management has a total balance of decisions in its favor. Under certain conditions, the activity of a collegiate body is as precise, fast, and energetic as the activity of a single manager. From a socio-political point of view, collegiate leadership has a number of advantages that make it the most important principle of Soviet organizational construction, and encourage, in the current period of militant work, its perseverance and consolidation. Collegiate leadership is the highest level of the school of state leadership. It is the only way to solve special questions relating to the interests of the whole. Collegiate work is also the best method for recovering the old bourgeois specialists through joint work in the new style of comradeship and for imbuing them with proletarian psychology. It is also the best method for controlling the bourgeois specialists until they overcome their old ways and previous psychology. Finally, and this is the most important thing, only collegiate management preserves responsible employees from being alienated in overly rigid and solitary special jobs and from being made narrow-minded employees, in this or that form, to this or that extent. Collegial leadership provides the necessary foundations for the success of the system of democratic centralism, as well as the best weapons against the resurrection of the narrow functionary mentality and the immovable bureaucracy in the apparatus of the Soviets. The success and strengthening of collegiate leadership is the guarantee of success in our economic struggle, which can only be realized by linking military methods with the creative initiative of conscious workers. Even if the RCP limits the collegiate leadership to the conditions of the present moment and decides on its military character, which guarantees precision, speed, and intensity to the work, it still recognizes, without any reservation, the collegiate leadership as the principle of organization of all the foundations that gives unity to the apparatus of the proletarian dictatorship. Therefore, all the organs of administrative leadership to which the major decisions of great responsibility correspond are organized in accordance with the decision of the 7th Congress of Soviets on the basis of limited collegiate leadership. The less important organizations in the Soviet apparatus, which are appointed by the governing bodies to carry out simple technical functions, are bound by the principle of single leadership. All the top economic management bodies will follow the same principles: presidium of the Supreme Economic Council, sections, main committees and centers, government economic councils and their sections, top management and zonal administrations of industrial plants. The sole management of factories and works in the view of the current insecure technical, economic, and social relations, and the incompetence of the best technical managers in solving the new and complicated economic and social tasks that arise from revolutionary change, in no way guarantees precise and efficient management. Factories and schools, which are natural centers of the proletarian masses, and natural schools for learning the art of management, must conduct themselves according to the principle of limited collegiate management. For the bodies subject to factory management, the principle of single management applies. Note, in agreement with the corresponding economic and trade union centers, single management will be allowed for small factories and for some military services. In the latter case, it is essential that the services have the most outstanding leaders and a correct organization of the technical and supply apparatus. In order to give the workers in all the collegiate bodies precision, speed, and intensity, they will be given special instruction in their work and in the ways and methods of carrying it out, and a continuous monitoring will be necessary to keep an eye on everything. Likewise, all the bodies that direct the formation of the collegiate bodies will be created, starting with the Central Committee of the RCP, in order to pay greater attention to the choice of purposes and the maintenance and shape of the personnel that make up collegiate bodies, and finally, to direct these personnel and all the technical considerations pertaining to their work. The conference was turbulent and feelings were high. The left, with their decentralist views, were constantly being compared to Makhno and Jean Vaclav Makayev. The drama occurring in the Ukraine did not go unnoticed by the party center, especially given that the right in Ukraine complained to Lenin about what was going on. At the 9th Party Congress in March and April, the same one in which Lutovanov delivered Schapnikov's theses, Lenin dedicates a portion of his speech to the proposals of Sapronov and his comrades, where he shuts them down. He says, "The theses of comrades Osinsky, Maximovsky, and Sapronov that appeared on March 23rd contain nothing but theoretical blunders. They say that corporate management, in one form or another, is an indispensable basis of democracy. I assert that you will find nothing like it in the 15 years pre-revolutionary history of the social democratic movement. Democratic centralism means only that representatives from the localities get together and elect a responsible body which is to do the administering. But how? That depends on how many suitable people, how many good administrators are available. Democratic centralism means that the Congress supervises the work of the Central Committee and can remove it and appoint another in its place. But if we were to go into the theoretical errors contained in these theses, we should never be done. I personally will not deal with this anymore, and will only say that the Central Committee adopted the only line that could be adopted on this question." Lenin would also state that the party would not recognize Sapronov's or the left's leadership of the Ukrainian party organization, even in spite of their protests that the Central Committee had been legally elected in the presence of Stalin. In the end, a new Ukrainian Central Committee was appointed, and the leftist leadership of the Ukrainian Communist Party was completely replaced with rightists. Sapronov's control over the Ukrainian Communist Party organization represented the zenith of the Democratic Centralist movement, but even after their failure here, they would not cease their activities. In the months following the Ninth Congress, the trade union debate would erupt, and the Democratic Centralists were active during this as well. They presented their own theses along with some other groups. In total, there were 6, but by the 10th Congress, only 3 programs survived: that of Schapiro and the Workers' Opposition, that of the 10 with Lenin, and that of Trotsky and Bukharin. But for the Democratic Centralists, the question of the unions was only but another aspect of the issue of bureaucracy and democracy in the party. Schapiro writes, "The Democratic Centralists regarded the trade union crisis as only an aspect of the general crisis within the party caused by over-centralization. In their view, there was little difference between the views of Trotsky and Lenin, which they regarded as merely 2 tendencies of one and the same group of militarizers of the national economy. They considered that the party discontent could be obviated by compromise and by more respect for the principle of party democracy." When the Kronstadt revolt came, the Democratic Centralists followed the party in describing it as a counter-revolution, and they assisted in its suppression. They were not implicated in the uprising the same way in which the Workers' Opposition were, and when factions were banned, the Democratic Centralists simply ended their faction. But a faction is just a name. They still retained their ideas, and as the party charted out its course, they raised their heads in protest when they felt that the party was veering off course. Such is the case in 1923, during the first struggle of the burgeoning left opposition against the ruling Troika. One thing that must be understood, however, is that the 1923 opposition, and even the left opposition as a whole, were not just a group of Trotsky's followers. Going into 1924, Osinski would break with the left and join Bukharin on the right. His former comrades, Smirnov and Sapronov, however, stood firm with their left viewpoints. When the alliance between Kamenev and Zinoviev with Stalin broke down in 1925, the two made a rapprochement with Trotsky and the left. In 1926, the joint opposition would be formed, and the Democratic Centralists initially involved themselves. Within the opposition, the Democratic Centralists distinguished themselves from Trotsky, and disagreements between these, quote, irreconcilables and the moderates led to a split. As Michel Olivier puts it, the Democratic Centralists participated in the unified opposition formed in the spring of 1926. Very soon, however, attempts to engage in discussions within the party proved to be futile, and the former Democratic Centralists perceived this failure to be a confirmation of what was then beginning to dawn upon them. The Bolshevik Party had become the party of the bureaucracy, and they had to make a commitment to form an independent organization. This is why they broke with the unified opposition after the declaration of peace, signed by 6 members of the Central Committee on October 16, 1926. They perceived this declaration as the capitulation of the unified opposition. In 1926, the Group of 15 was formed by the Democratic Centralists. After the Democratic Centralists break with the left, they now viewed the Russian Communist Party as degenerate. They started to denounce the Soviet state as a police state and were convinced that the Thermidor had taken hold. By now, they had taken up the view of the Workers' Group and the Workers' Shrouf that a new workers' communist organization needed to be formed, that the Russian Communist Party was irreformable. The Democratic Centralists united around the platform of the Group of 15. This manifesto appealed to other left irreconcilables in the Bolshevik Leninists, and some of those Bolshevik Leninists would break with them and join the Democratic Centralists. But for now, we'll stop right here, and we'll discuss the writings and activities of the Democratic Centralists from 1926 onwards, imprisoned in exile, in the next video.